Good afternoon, everyone. Good to see so many of you on a rainy afternoon. My name is Andrew Liu. I wear two main hats. One is banking, and the other one is charity. I love both of them. Let me start with a few remarks on the topic itself. So some of you I've spoken to can't even remember the name of the topic, Strategic Mastery, Creating a Positive Impact. I like to paraphrase the discussion to managing strategy in a changing world. So I repeat, managing strategy in a changing world. Now, from the presentation that Dr. Millie Yu gave us, we found that all these different concepts can come together in a very diverse mix such that it forms the core of what we call strategy. Now, while doing the research for this particular presentation, I found that there is no time like the present to revisit strategy. When was the last time that your board met on strategy? How often do your staff talk about strategy? And if the answers are very infrequent or we haven't done it for a long time, there is no time like the present to revisit strategy. And these are the following reasons. The first is, of course, the leadership in Singapore is changing. We are now talking about social compact. What is life beyond the 5 C's? What kind of life do we want beyond the 5 C's? And we're talking about things like a permanent underclass. How to mitigate the problems of a permanent underclass. In order not to leave anyone behind, we have to make sure that everyone is taken care of. Okay, so the leadership is changing, and so along with it, the social compact for Singapore. Another good reason, you heard this morning about ESG. Everyone is talking about ESG. It's a fashionable thing to talk about these days. Okay, corporates are embarking on ESG. Charities should also embark on the ESG. But my purpose is not to regurgitate what you heard this morning. My purpose is to tell you that if you, as a charity or social service organization, embark on ESG, you are capable of doing this thing called a funding benefit for your charity like no other. Because gone are those days where a charity will ask a corporation, a commercial entity, for money. And then once that's given, then we'll see you next year, maybe. Okay, those days are totally gone. Okay, what we have now is ESG. Now, to the extent that corporates do their ESG, charities must also rise to the occasion, identify with the commercial entities on their ESG programs and become partner to them. Now, it's going to take time, but this is a lot more sustainable than asking for a check every single year. So I repeat, get into the ESG books of the corporate partners or your potential donors and do your own ESG. If you are able to align your ESG approaches with that of a corporation, I think you have a good thing going and it's a lot more sustainable. Third reason why I think this is a good time to do strategy is that we all probably heard of all the recent developments in terms of the saga with the FTX and all that. Now, in the FTX instance, $2 billion was lost. Okay, simply lost. And the new CEO had only one thing to say about the culture of the company. The culture was very toxic. Okay, so our job is not just to govern, but to look at things that are a little bit more harder to put your finger on, like culture, corporate culture. Toxic corporate culture can sink a corporate entity or a charity. Okay, so this is not something that we should just make light of. And recently, we also have the cases of donations from money launderers and so on and so forth. The point being that your corporate culture cannot be neglected. Your point being that the corporate culture must be part of your strategy, no matter how difficult or how uncomfortable that case may be. So for these reasons, I think it is very timely for all charities to examine, re-examine, fine-tune your strategy, because especially with the advent of the technological advances and the changes that are going on, we have no choice. One more example. When we first started measuring our donors profile, we found that only 5% of our donors are individuals. Today, I just got a message that we are 34% of our donors are individuals. What has changed? The technology has changed. Social media is here to stay. Individual donors have become a very large proportion of your donor base. So you have to cultivate them. You have to be able to give them a brand that's so attractive that they will continue to be with you through thick and thin. And nowadays you can do it. In my time, it was you pay $35,000 to Straits Times for a full page color ad. Those days are gone. But in its place, we have now inexpensive, affordable social media for which you definitely need to exploit. So for those reasons and many others, it is timely for you to re-examine your corporate strategy. So with that in mind, I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves. I think Dr. Millie Yu, even yourself, can you reintroduce yourself to the audience and tell us a little bit maybe about your personal life? Thank you.
Okay, got it. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the very nice introduction and the briefing of kind of summary of the re-emphasize of why it's important to do strategy. So personally, I'm actually originally from Taiwan. I moved to Singapore 10 years ago. And right now, I'm in Singapore University of Social Sciences, and I teach topics like strategic HRM, strategic human resource management, and stakeholder management in nonprofit setting. Yeah, so I look forward to the panel.
I am Hao Yao. Well, I'm a private investor, so I'm on my own investment business. That's why I'm in the Securities Investors Association, I suppose. I also spend a lot of time in the charity sector. I'm on the board of Credit Counseling Singapore, the National Kidney Foundation, Sing Health Fund, and of course, SIAS is also a charity. Maybe I say a few words since my moderator has already started off, and Dr. Millie has also said a few things on first strategy and creating a purposeful impact. So I get my 5 minutes of fame as well. Right? So I wanted to say something about creating impact. In fact, I want to flip it around and say we should not be creating negative impact. That's a first. We mustn't all assume that because we are a charity and we have all come together to do good, you're automatically doing good. So the first thing is do no harm. Now, for example, I'd like to mention a couple of areas. One, you may inadvertently be doing negative impact. If, for example, I'll give you a quick one. For individuals in debt distress, people think that they are financially not as literate. But it's not true. Well, we have done studies and they show that financially literate people can also be in debt distress, or debt distressed people could actually be more financially literate. So when we design programs, we mustn't inadvertently create a negative impact. So we must ensure that our programs, for example, financial literacy programs, don't inadvertently get people into start borrowing and then end up with debt distress. And that goes for other areas. For example, anti-smoking. If you introduce it at early age, do you actually cause kids or teens to start smoking? You know, you may inadvertently be causing that. And that goes for teen sexual education and goes on for many other things. So that's one. We must always be on the lookout. Second, we may have moral hazard issues. So as charities, we help people. But do we inadvertently also cause them to get into problems later in life? So for example, if you gave debt relief. Would that cause an individual to take more risk, right? And thinking that maybe somebody will be there to help them. So when we design programs, we also have to be aware of moral hazard, because that can also cause people to get into trouble. And one other area which is a little bit more difficult is, are we the best provider of that particular service in the sector we are in? Because we could be inadvertently causing a poorer outcome should that beneficiary or individual be going to another provider. So that's a much harder question to answer. And the only way we can assure ourselves is that if we continually check the landscape to make sure that our programs stay relevant and stay best in class. Because as an individual who needs help, if you go to an organization and the organization, for example, unable to help you, so that organization would have more or less wasted the individual's time and resources. Whereas the individual go to another organization may get a better outcome, right? So this is much harder to calibrate, but it's something that boards and management, I think, should continue to check on. Because it's always very easy to say, my organization is this size, I have one program, and if I have a hammer, everything's a nail. So I just want a little bit more resources next year to continue more of the same program or just to expand the program. But we must really check, what are other people doing? What are the needs, which are always changing and evolving? And that's the only way we can ensure that we are providing a very positive impact, in the work we do. I guess I better pass it down to my other panelists.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I am Suen. I oversee strat planning and audience engagement for the National Gallery. So a little bit about myself. I've been with the museum sector for more than 25 years. And what drew me first and foremost to working in a museum, I have to say, it goes back to my own experience encountering the power of museums during a very difficult time, right? So I don't know, show of hands, if any one of you remember the impact of 9/11, September 11. Yeah, so I don't know where you were on that particular day. I was actually near Ground Zero. I was living in New York. I was there for 2 years pursuing my further studies. And it really was a huge experience in the sense that, typically when you go to a big museum like the Metropolitan Museum, you'll notice that the permanent galleries, the Islamic section of the museum is typically very empty, right? No one really goes there. Everyone just goes for the special exhibition and the big blockbusters. But, the week subsequent to 9/11, I noticed that Islamic section of the gallery was really packed, and it was packed with people from all walks of life. And why do they go there? I think they go to museums because the world is so chaotic outside, and they are really looking for truths. They're looking for institutions that they can trust, they can understand the past to make sense of the present so that they can perhaps chart a way forward. And that to me stuck with me. And when I came back to Singapore, to fulfill the rest of my bond, it was something that I truly believe that museums have a role to contribute to positive change and to support communities amidst us. So I guess that goes back to Andrew's, the way he was framing the question about strategy in times of change. And for me, I feel that strategy has to be beyond just a process, right? If it's embedded in your vision, so it becomes a strategic vision, it can actually be very powerful in terms of steering an organization through a tumultuous period, as we've all experienced, which is the pandemic. Just take ourselves, 2 years back, 3 years back in 2020, at the height of the pandemic. I recall one of the first questions that the gallery was asking ourselves is, how can we bring comfort to communities with what we have? And more specifically, how could we use art to support the mental health of people amidst us? And that led us to actually partner with SGH, with art therapists in SGH, to deliver a series of art and mindfulness programs. So that was really the first time that we were looking at the intersection between art and mindfulness, because at that time we were hearing, the frontline healthcare workers, they were under tremendous stress. They were having to not only be socially distant from their families because of safety reasons, but they were also dealing with a lot of churn. And a lot of them were really just focused on just getting the job done, but they were also holding a lot in. So by having these sessions, which in small groups they were allowed to unpack through art, one of my favorite stories that I've encountered from as a result of this session was really one of them looking at an image, right? So art is very open-ended. So they were looking at an artwork by Georgette Chen, and it depicted just lotus. It's called Lotus in the Breeze. So at first glance, you can look at it as a beautiful picture, but and that's if you look at it from the surface level. But I think with many of these mindfulness courses, you encourage the participants to slow down, to focus on certain aspects that they may not normally observe. And so one of them started paying attention to, actually the lotus is resilient because it emerges from mud. And sometimes we get so stuck in our own situations that we focus a lot on the mud that we're in rather than the possibility of transcending that situation towards something that's positive. So I think it's through these sorts of reflections that it really, and conversations and dialogue that they share, that really strengthens the belief that art can actually create and contribute to positive change. So I guess with these simple examples that I've shared, it also shows that the role of museums today have expanded. It's not longer just collecting, presenting artifacts, but it's also about being embedded with community concerns, addressing real world issues, and also contributing to positive change. So that's a little bit about myself and also the organization that I work from.
Thank you very much, all the panelists, for your personal sharing. That's really appreciated. Now let's go on to the questions by the audience. Remind everyone that you can key in your questions or your vote for the questions rather through this pigeonhole link that we have provided. The question is, it takes time to define strategy, get buy-in for strategy, and champion strategic planning and execution across the organization. Do you have good stories of charities doing it well? Very good question. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up to the panel. Maybe Dr. Millie, we start with you.
Yeah, I definitely think I agree with you that it takes a lot of effort, and it needs to be very deliberate and very intentional that the board and the board leadership and the top leadership of the organization know that it is necessary, and it's the due diligence, it's the responsible thing to do to review strategy on a regular basis. So this needs to be recognized at the top management level, and at the same time, thinking about so planning through reviewing strategy, defining and reviewing the vision and mission, that is in of itself could take up to a year of exercise to review, to reflect, and then to discover. Whether I have good stories to tell, I probably wouldn't name names of the organization, but then I do know that organizations, a lot of these charity organizations right now, they are facing at least two battles. Right. One battle is that you have to deal with your day-to-day operation. But on the other battle is that you have to think about transformation. And at the end of the day, you go into the back room and you think about, how do we transform? What is the next step? How do you do your environmental scan? Who do we serve? What kind of new programs and initiatives that we need to develop? Who are the underserved, right? So that is kind of like in the back end, they will have to have that conversation. And that takes a lot of effort, and that really relies on the leadership, the influence of the leadership to get buy-ins, to get information from key opinion leaders on the ground and throughout different levels of organization. So I think it has to be done at two different levels. You need to also build a transition strategy, right? Once you know that, hey, this is a vision, this is a plan that you are not going to switch to that new strategy right away. You also need to build in a transitional plan. And I think a lot of times leaders also don't pay enough attention to the transitional plan, and they think that the change can be implemented automatically overnight. And that's not fair for the staff as well, because the staff, once again, if you want to implement change, you are also doing what you're doing right now and learning the new things that you have to do, right? So whenever you are planning a strategy, you always have to do kind of bootstrapping, meaning that you are doing something that you're already doing, but you also have to plan ahead. So so really a lot of mental well-being and mental sustainability is required.
Well, I think strategic planning, basically, you have to move away from just looking at your day-to-day activities. So not just how many clients you serve or help, but really look at the whole landscape and what's the ideal state of your organization in this whole landscape. And the landscape may be continually changing. So we should be client-centric, not program-centric. We should walk our client's journey. If we put our flag down as an organization and say that we are in this space, then it is our obligation to help as many as possible that come to us. So we shouldn't just look at how many we serve, but actually who is that we can serve in the whole space, all right? And if we do turn these people away, what happens to them? Do you know? Can we create more programs to help those, right? Or to refer to others, to tie up with other providers and so forth. So when we do strategic planning, we should think big, and not say, okay, we only this size, so we can only go to this size, and we only have talent or staff that can perform this program, so we just continue with this program. But really, you got to look at the whole space. What are the needs? What are the client's needs, right? And not say, well, we only do one part of it, and well, you have to go somewhere else or something else, And that's where the strategic planning comes in, right? You really got to think big and think of the whole space, and then after that, then find ways to transition or transform yourself into that space. It could be major changes, it could be mergers, it could be doing up new programs, joining up with other entities. But I think that's the only way that if you really want to serve the help seekers in that space well. Yeah.
I would also add on, I do agree with everything that was the points that were raised. For the gallery, we just completed our 5-year plan. And every year, of course, we do an annual review. And, as part of the 5-year plan, it's not enough for us to just talk amongst ourselves. And by ourselves, I mean just the staff within the organization. It's important for us because we feel like the gallery is part of, we're just a node, right, in the ecosystem. And for us to be able to achieve impact, we do need partnerships. So what we've done as part of our strategic planning, we've invited our sister institutions, so the gallery, Singapore Art Museum, and Singapore Thailand Print Institute. These 3 form what we call the Visual Arts Cluster. We then also extended the invitation to other stakeholders, for example, the Ministry of Education, Ministry MCCY, right? And also STB, because they're also part of us being a cultural offering for tourist visitors to Singapore. So these are examples of the additional stakeholders that we include. We get their feedback, we share what our plans are, but we also collectively look at the changing landscape. So in Singapore, we know, for example, means an aging population. One of the key problems that we'll be facing with, of course, is dementia is on the rise, for example. And how does creative health and art and well-being, become an important pillar, a permanent pillar that we start to focus on beyond just artistic excellence and educational engagement and outreach, but also our role in creative health and some of the examples that I've shared earlier. So I think doing these mega reviews once every 3 to 5 years, coupled with an annual review every year with a lens of what's also evolving in the external landscape, I think can be a very good way for us to stay relevant.
Thank you very much. Let me just share, we can call it a success story or not, from my own charity. First of all, strategic meetings by the board can be fun. It need not be state and boring affairs. It can be a lot of fun. You need to get the participation level and enthusiasm up. So this was one of our offsite meetings where we brainstormed the mission and vision, and that was the last 4 years ago. What happened was that at the end of the brainstorming session, someone came up with the idea that don't be program based. Remember what Howie said, don't just look at your programs and be limited by your activities. But so we are in the disabled art space. So the thing that we came up with is beyond the vision, the mission. It says all forms of art, all forms of disability. Now that was a very liberating statement, because then we can go on to do things as far as your creativity and your imagination can go. So for example, we came up with a full-scale musical production at the Victoria Theatre, which has never been done before, with front-ended by our people with disability. So these things are possible. So do not underestimate the value of brainstorming or strategic planning, okay? You never know what can come up. In any case, even if nothing comes out, the circumstances, the factors which surround you now, which I mentioned at my opening remarks, have changed. And therefore, you will need to tailor your strategy along the lines of the external factors that have now come into play. Okay. Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I do want to just add on. So you also want to review your organization, whether there is a process in place to review strategy. And are you incorporating, so what's Suen's example is that the gallery incorporate comments and feedback and views from external stakeholders. But within the organizations, are you collecting information and perspectives from your internal stakeholders, such as your employees and even your volunteers? Because sometimes the volunteers are very much embedded in the organizations. So are you collecting information from them? Are you or are you identifying them and incorporating their views and their perspectives? So you also want to have that perspective and incorporate that information.
Thank you, Dr. Millie. So move on to the next question. Any advice on how do we handle situations where members of the board and the senior management could not align themselves? We are designing and implementing a new program of services. I guess the issue is when your board or members of the board cannot agree on what the strategy, or maybe cannot even agree on what is the conclusion as far as the current situation is, and cannot get alignment. Therefore, resulting in difficulty in implementing new programs or services. I hope I've got my interpretation of that question is correct. So, all right. Anyone want to take this on? What if there's disagreement between board members or between board members and the staff with regards to what's to be done strategically? But before I hand it over, one small comment from me. It's so hard for anyone, including board members, let alone staff, to even want to talk about strategy. Especially for staff members, they feel that strategy is not their domain, that somehow this is something for the management or for the board to decide. Actually, it is not. It is, the culture should be such that everyone should speak his mind. And it doesn't matter whether who speaks his or her mind, but the fact is that we are doing culture from the ground up, which is the reality check that we all need. So let me hand it over to the panel. Any questions on what happened? How do you handle disagreements?
Well, I guess that if there is a disagreement, it may also be because the vision as articulated by the organization, perhaps, one, it might provoke us to think, is the vision still valid? Is it relevant? Is it outmoded? Is it aligned with what society needs? Because fundamentally, board members are holding organizations accountable to what your core competencies are, what your goals are. But if that goalpost has shifted, either because the management has experienced that the shift is necessary, but perhaps it's not been articulated, then I think that needs to be thrashed out during a board retreat, where really you could relook the entire vision, mission, and also core offerings. I mean, in our case, I have to say our board members are quite clear where They do not micromanage. They are looking at sort of like the bigger strategy pieces, and whether that is something that is aligned with what we say we want to do. There were a bit of questions initially about how much should we get into the whole wellness track, and because I think, but that question was prompted because they didn't fundamentally understand the potential of museums to play a role in supporting communities, and they thought maybe that would be best done by the healthcare sector. But when they started seeing examples of partnerships, I think there was a point about partnerships, because we know that we're not the experts here, but we open up our assets to allow others to use it in various different ways, and it actually ends up benefiting communities. Then they started to kind of expand the understanding of that's the role that we can play and contribute positive change. So that's perhaps one way we have navigated that challenge.
Well, if I may take a shot at this, actually, this situation shouldn't even come about if you do the strategic planning thoroughly. Strategic planning can starts from staff retreats, or even getting consultants in, or even surveying your beneficiaries, donors, or volunteers. So it's a big process, right? And in building a new strategy or in reviewing your strategy, and only after that does it go up to the board, and then board will take in all these inputs and then agree on a strategy. So that's democracy. You vote, right? I suppose at some stage, if there is disagreement, and after that, everybody should be aligned to it already. So it shouldn't be just an individual on the board or on the staff who's objecting to a strategy. It's to build that strategy is already a long process, and as she mentioned, could be a year, and involves many, if not all parties involved, all stakeholders. So this situation shouldn't arise if done properly.
If I may, I think the misalignment is more like, perhaps from an employee standpoint, they may think that they want something, and then they want to they have their practices, their routine, and then it may be a different direction that the board wants to take. And I would think that it's kind of like a disagreement rather than misalignment, because like what Hao Yao is saying, that misalignment would not happen if there is enough thorough discussion and due diligence on the conversation on strategy execution. But it could be disagreement on the execution, or disagreement on what can be carried out on the ground. So I think that may be because of misunderstanding or lack of information from both sides. Perhaps the board may not understand what are the challenges on the ground, or perhaps the employees may not understand the board's macro level perspective, right? So I think that disagreement is actually an opportunity to for more discussion. I would highly encourage staff to really invite your board members to join you, to go on to some activities, go on to some events, and really to see what it's like to visit beneficiaries and home visits. And I think it's also important for the board to not hide themselves in the black room and think that strategy is this mysterious box, but invite allow more voices to channel up from the ground up. And so I think that misalignment would not happen if there is some more thorough common understanding being established.
And that should be driven by the value systems as well, to the extent that, back again to Hao Yao's point, okay, don't focus on the programs or activities that you do, because the board is responsible for strategic direction. I always leave it to the executive director in terms of implementation. And so operational issues, I leave it to them. How they want to do it is something that the board should not get involved in. Otherwise, the staff will get totally confused. I know of this charity that has 12 different subcommittees. They don't talk to each other, and therefore, to the extent that it becomes dysfunctional, and that's something that we have to safeguard against. So, are there any other comments from the floor? Anyone at all on what has been discussed so far? If not, can I ask you to give a big hand to the panelists this afternoon? Thank you very much for being such a patient and enthusiastic audience, and thank you, members of the panel, for your contributions. Thank you all, and good afternoon.